with you something that's got it. More of a personal kind of thing. So for the last several years, I've been working on a book project called Permission. And my hope today is that we'll have an informal sort of conversation and experience share. So I'm not taking this sort of expert role and sort of disseminating information. I'm looking for back and forth on this. And this is really the first time that I've shared this topic with other people. It's also not a sort of scientific or data-based sort of conversation. So I'm making my observations and open to your inputs as well. A lot of what we're talking about today is the interplay between our cultures and our sort of environmental influences and our personality. So I have a lot to learn in that, right? So you're from a very different part of the world in many cases, and I'm quite curious to hear what your experience has been. So that's the sort of tone I'd like to set. As always, I'd love for it to be informal in terms of the interactivity. So feel free to throw in a question to the chat or just unmute. There's no formality over here on my side. And I think one of the fun things for me, sort of just preparing for this, was thinking back to all of the great conversations I've had with type practitioners over the years. And one of the most common themes, if you think about why are you here today, why would you spend time in your busy schedule joining a personality type or psychological type conference? And chances are it's because you're passionate about the topic. And somewhere along the way, the passion was ignited for you by an insight or a resonance or some sort of powerful takeaway that you experienced from experiencing this. And one of the most sort of common or frequent conversations I've had with practitioners is the way that personality type has validated them. A way for them to articulate, wow, I'm different than a lot of the people around me, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a sort of the way that people start to feel that they've been affirmed in who they are is, I think, a big theme that's come out of a number of my conversations with practitioners. And it's not a surprise to me that some of the less common, statistically speaking, personality types in the broader population gravitate towards this as an explanation for why they've often felt a little out of place in more common situations. So one of my hopes with this permission topic, and eventually hopefully a book, is to activate this concept of validation by giving permission to people to be more of themselves. And for us here as practitioners is to be thinking about, how can I create a life of alignment between my personality type and my natural strengths and all the things that come with the 4-letter code and our temperaments and the life choices that I'm making, even though the environment around me may not be naturally encouraging of certain of those choices. So when I talk about personality type today, I'm specifically honing in on both the preferences elements, the standard 4-letter code, but I'd also like you to consider the temperament elements and the way in which our environmental influences have either encouraged or discouraged those as well. From a core values perspective, when we're told to do things that are not consistent with who we fundamentally are at a core values level, creates a lot of problems. And I think for a lot of people, the journey has been to unpack that and help them find sort of a way to connect with those core values. So I love this quote. You've probably seen it in various different formulations. So a number of people have written it down differently. This is the original wording. So from Carl himself, Dr. Jung, I'm going to try to read it with a little inflection. So as he says, I myself am a question which is addressed to the world, and I must communicate my answer, for otherwise I am dependent upon the world's answer. All right. So in other words, and I think this is what he's trying to say here, if you don't know who you are, the world is going to tell you. All right. And to the extent that we're all a mix between our natural selves, and we talked about this from a psychological type perspective, there's a mix between our natural selves and what the world wants us to be. And if we don't assert ourselves into that dialogue, if we don't push against the world's wants, the external forces are going to fill in the blanks for us. And we're going to end up doing and saying and sort of acting in a way that may or may not be consistent with who we fundamentally are. So I like to think about all of us as unique snowflakes, right? So we have a unique set of circumstances that have brought us into the world. And at this very moment in time, there's no other person who has exactly that mix of your family experiences, your cultural experiences, your education, your life experiences, who you've hung out with, what you've done, how have you traveled, your gender, and then fundamentally your personality type underneath all that. And I'd like to suggest that we're living in a healthy intersection, if we do it right, between those external elements and that internal element that is our psychological type. So I want to talk about this. One of the most sort of key concepts, and the reason why I started with heavenly objects in space, is that I do think that a lot of what drives us is inertia. So if we think about physical inertia, we think about the resistance of an object to change in its velocity or direction, the tendency of things to sort of keep doing what they're doing. And my personal belief, and this is one of those places I don't have data to support, this is just an observation that I've made over the years, is that psychological inertia is the most powerful psychological force. This is a person's mental resistance to a change in their velocity or direction. Generally speaking, we tend to do what we've done before. And one of the things I want to sort of engage in as a dialogue here today is, if our inertia has been established by the world around us, not who we fundamentally are, what does that mean in terms of the life choices that we're making and the life that we're living, either in alignment with or out of alignment with our fundamental personality type? So I believe that the vast majority of humans, in order to make a major change in their lives, to get back into alignment, it tends to require a greater external force than their inertial forces, right? This is how physics works. So this could be the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, a near-death experience, something that shakes them out of their inertial orbit where they've been going for years, and all of a sudden they say, you know, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And they reconsider and they take stock of perhaps a different direction that they like to go in their lives. But it typically doesn't happen by waking up on a Tuesday and then suddenly doing something very dramatically different. The inertia carries people forward until some greater force comes in. And as a result, and again, this is one of my own observations or beliefs, is that most people spend the first 50 years of their lives seeking to fulfill a definition of success that's fundamentally at odds with who they are as a person. That's not everyone, right? Some of us are fortunate to have been given permission by circumstances around us. But if you think about the majority of people who are unhappy in their jobs or unhappy in their relationships, they're striving towards, they're attempting to achieve a definition of success that's just inconsistent with who they are. We're going to be talking about why that is and what you can do about it as we go through the rest of the sort of program. And again, I'm sort of setting the table, but very soon we'll be inviting you to participate in the conversation. So an example I wanted to share, one of my earlier coaching engagements was with a woman who was trying to make a career transition. And in her family, right, success was defined by finance. Her dad, her grandparents, her uncles, her brothers, her older brothers, were all in finance. And so she chose an educational track that led her to finance. And then she spent 15 years working in finance. And for her, what that meant was really working in a solitary environment, working on financial numbers, spreadsheets, and so on, and making money. And she was successful at it, right? So this was a success in the sense that, like, she was paid well and she was promoted and she was recognized as being effective and sort of capable in her field. But there was always a general sense of dissatisfaction or disquietude for her, a sense of something missing, or a sense of, I'm looking at my brothers and I see how happy they are doing the exact same thing that I'm doing and not feeling that happy about. And so through the course of our conversations, her personality type emerged as ESFJ. And in particular, the extrovert and the feeler were completely unsatisfied in this particular environment. And so, charting the course for her really led to a career path that was much more consistent with satisfying her need to be much more interactive and also to be a helper. Actually seeing a tangible impact on her work that helped people in a way that she could see right in front of her made it like a massive difference in her sense of satisfaction. But it was a difficult process to recalibrate her definition of success, right? It's baked in when it's from such a strong family basis. And it was really difficult for her to go against that. And when we break out of our inertial orbit, right, especially if we've been in it for a period of time, like 15 years, we pick up what I call turbulence. that sensation of like, should I be doing this? This feels wobbly. This feels uncomfortable. And you hear things from your friends and family like, I don't think you should do that. You are successful. What are you doing? And I'll personalize this myself. So I used to be a corporate lawyer with large law firms. And to go through the process of going to law school for 3 years and spending a lot of money on that, and then getting a job at a sort of premier firm and being successful in that category. When I left that, people thought I was crazy. Family members, friends, what are you doing? You're making a lot of people who wish they could have chosen that path, or people who had chosen that path and were rationalizing their own choices, were the most adamant that I not make this move, right? That it's too risky and so on. And these are the kinds of things that typically happen when we go against the grain of what our society wants, our friends and family want. And it requires a certain fortitude to do that. So against that framework, against that sort of backdrop, what I'd like to do now is go through some of the more central elements of our environmental influences. And I'd like to encourage you to do some reflection and introspection on your own experience. And I'm recognizing that this may be intense for some people. So I want to stay at sort of like a high level. So, to the extent that you had a problematic experience or something like that, we can simply say I had a problematic experience. We don't need to get into the ins and outs of that. But what I'm looking to do from a takeaway perspective is have some realizations or illuminations around, yes, I was really fortunate to have this influence in my life, and it really empowered me and encouraged me to move in this direction, even though some of the other aspects of my life may not have been as encouraging. So let's take parenting. So the way I'm going to sort of ask you to consider this, and I'll give you a moment to sort of reflect on this, and we'll discuss. In general, would you say that the parenting environment that you grew up in encouraged you to be who you really are? And we can talk about that in terms of your type and your temperament. Or did it discourage you? Right. So I'll give you a couple examples. So my friend Mark did not have a dad. His dad was not in the picture, and had a number of other sort of family challenges. But his mom was a huge champion of Mark. She believed in Mark, right? And she believed that Mark was going to be capable of doing amazing things. So Mark would put down a 5. And I've met his mom. Yvonne is an amazing person who encourages him at every turn. And so he gets to put down a 5 because part of who he is has been the encouragement of that environment. My friend Willie, on the other side of the equation, to this day can close his eyes and hear his father's voice telling him why he will fail. And that's not a good influence. And so he'd be putting down a -5 score. And again, this is not scientific. This is just to get you thinking about what are these environmental influences. So enough talking for me. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect on that. Take up to a minute if you like. And then I'd love to hear from you. So either into the chat or other observations verbally as well. I'm sensitive to the fact that by asking about parenting in a Jung conference, we're getting a little Freudian here. All right, thank you for sharing, Laura. If you care to elaborate, go ahead. Marky, 3, freedom to choose from other, critique of choices from father. Yeah, so a mix from Marky, I get that. Thank you, Renee. Yeah, good share. One of the interesting sort of conversations that most practitioners have sort of put the analysis through is taking into account your parents' personality types. Also changes a lot of our expectations. So my sister, who's a strong feeling type, recognizing that my dad's a strong thinking type has allowed her to reset certain expectations around some of their interactions. And in a sense, give him permission to be himself, and not to sort of hold him to a standard that, would have been perhaps unrealistic for him. Yeah, and I think people are interestingly noting the difference between one parent and the other parent, right? So I appreciate that subtlety. Yeah. Any reflections, observations that you care to share? So Sue didn't get a lot of discouragement, but not a lot of active encouragement either. Good share, Chris. Thank you. And my own personal experience, my parents have a very hands-off approach. So whatever choices I made were thrown back at me. Well, is that what you want to do? Do you feel like that's right? The only thing they ever cared about was whether I was putting in the effort. And that for my personality type could not have been a better fit, whether by instinct or accident. So fortunate in that. Thank you for sharing, David. There's a family here in the community where we live now where the 8th child of 8 is essentially parenting and raising himself from what the community can observe. So I don't know how he's probably going to score himself as a 0 on this one. Yeah. Are any questions, other observations on this one? I'm going to move into culture next, but I want to, yeah, go ahead, Claire, please.
Yeah, I mean, just from mine, I mean, I was very encouraged probably under the age of 12. So to be given anything that I, to play or be artistic in that way, and also completely encouraged to get an education and the same potential be the daughters or the sons. So I put myself as a 5 then, but then later on changed, curtailed, and the expectation was more tempered by the fears of parents or the what they saw as being the right thing to do or the sensible thing to do. So timing of how it was handled.
It's a really interesting clarification, and I love the word sensible thing to do, right? Because who's defining that, right?
Exactly.
Is it something internal for them, or is it what are the neighbors going to think, or what are the people at church going to think? And it's fascinating to consider the sources of these influences, and really who is in charge of what we're being told and what we're being encouraged or not to do.
Yeah, I think it was probably a fear from one of their own upbringing and what security meant. And the second thing, probably, I wanted to change my job regularly and have that variety. And whilst I thought that was tough and scary to do, I had to do that. Whereas that, my parents' generation you get a job and you have, again, that security of job for 30 years. And what are you thinking of,
Yep. So you get some generational influences and sort of the conventional wisdom of a time that's past, not applying necessarily to a current time. I think that's another really interesting nuance. So, when I think about what I'm going to call programming, right? So programming is, looking both ways before you cross the street. That's a good program. We should keep that one. But the program that my client had, which is you should go into finance, was a program that she needed to rewrite. And that program is hard to rewrite because it had been part of her life for so long, and she was still surrounded by that at every family outing. So she became the outlier. She went in a different direction, and that's hard to do. Mandy, I love the element that you've introduced, which is, as parents ourselves, how can we be sort of paying attention to this? So I've got an ESTP daughter. My wife is an ESTJ. Those temperament differences are significant. And my son's an ENTP, I'm an ENTP. We have our own challenges, just given the similarities. But it allows us to, we think, hopefully, fingers crossed, knock on wood, create an environment where they're more likely to feel encouraged to be their natural selves, as opposed to trying to adhere to an expectation that they turn into an ESTJ or an ENTP like us. Again, I'm not giving anyone's parents a free pass on this, but for the most part, our parents tend to create an environment that would be perfect if they were the child. And they're surprised when, it doesn't work. It's as simple as two extroverted parents being blessed with an introvert kid and having 50-person birthday parties not go well because, well, the kid didn't seem happy with that. What's wrong with the kid? Well, we have some basis for understanding that. Thank you. You've exceeded my expectations in engaging on this one. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to culture? Marky, I love it. Yeah. Did someone speak up? Go for it.
I was going to speak. I've read stats in terms of the age of the child, where on average, a child will hear 9 positives to every 1 negative from a parent when they're under 5. But by the time they're teenagers, it flips and it's 9 negatives to every 1 positive. And that seems to be most people's experience, something like that.
We really tend to step it up in the parenting role, taking a more hands-on approach, and that's consistent with what you were saying, Claire. Like free pass until you're 12, and then we're going to take control and make sure that you turn out okay. Yeah. Of course, that maybe this is a correlation to why teenagers don't listen. All right, so culture. Here's our next lens to look through, right? So one of the things that as I look through the cultural lens, I always like to take away the words good and bad and put in the words different, right? So when you travel to a new place, it's not that it's better or worse than your place, it's just different. And if we can maintain that openness, we can start to reflect on, okay, well, what does that difference mean for me? How does that show up? And I think what's really interesting to consider then is what culture did you grow up in? And which aspects of your personality type were encouraged or discouraged? And very similar to the parenting, you might see a positive from one parent and a negative from the other. You may see that certain aspects of your personality have been encouraged and others discouraged, right? So if you grow up in the US or Argentina or Italy, where the expectation is to be a social contributor in an extroverted style, right? And you're an extrovert, well, you've probably been encouraged to be your natural personality in that attribute. But if you're an introvert in those cultures, right, that actually may be going against the grain, in the same way that if you've got a natural preference for extroversion and you're growing up in certain parts of Asia or Scandinavia, you'll have the reverse experience. You can go through the different aspects of personality and consider this. So, it's always tricky to generalize, right? But I think people typically resonate with things like, well, let's say the German culture encourages the thinking preference more than the feeling preference in general, right? Well, what does it mean then if you grew up as a feeler in that culture? Or if you're an NT conceptualizer growing up in a SJ culture like Japan, right? Much more focused on tradition. Have you been encouraged to think about the world in the way that you're naturally wired to do so? So I'd love to sort of, again, give you a moment to reflect on this, encourage or discourage. You're taking the overall score. Averaging it out, and then share into the chat or share into the discussion. I love it. Carmel, right out of the gate. I left England many years ago, very S, and feel much more at home in France, where I've lived for several decades and where my N is better nourished, right? Now, that may be a generalization that some people resonate with and others do not. That's fine. But you found a place that feels more of a fit. You're reminding me, so years ago, a woman in a workshop came up to me. She said that she had grown up in Beijing. And as a big time extrovert, this was a challenge for her because the culture kept saying, can you be more quiet? She didn't want to. So she came to the US and she's like, now I feel like I'm a fish in the ocean, right? She's like, I just feel very comfortable here. And then she paused and she considered, and she's like, but my husband's an introvert and now he's a fish in the desert. And I love this sort of a concept, which is like, you can move to different places and feel like you've found your place because of the way that it encourages a natural style that's been there for you the whole time. Yeah. Laura, thank you for sharing. Discouraged. Interesting. Yeah, so like when I go from Boston, which is definitely not only as a US city, but also a fairly fast-paced US city like New York, definitely strong on the judging encouragement. Moving to Spain was great. Whenever it happens, and so there's a sense in which that felt very comfortable and familiar. Renee, I wonder for you in Switzerland, you get off the plane in Geneva and there's all these, watch and clock commercials, like the timeliness of the Swiss. As a perceiver, how does that experience work for you?
Yeah, I try to avoid that. But like I said, I like the more consensual culture. The whole constitution is organized to be as representative as possible, and so we always need to find win-win solutions, and that takes longer to reach, but it feels very inclusive, and that works really well with my preferences.
Yeah, especially
I've only learned about that once I got out of it as well. So I like living and working in other countries because I have to explain to people, why is it we do it like that in Switzerland? Yeah, why is it? And so you can more easily compare and understand the differences as well.
Thank you for sharing. And I, having had that conversation with you, Renee, the NF idealist in you, when you start talking about the Swiss constitutionality and the consensus building, there's real passion that comes from you about that. And there's that sort of simpatico of feeling connected on a core values level with one's own culture. And I think that's powerful. I think that, it's difficult when you feel at odds with your culture, but it's powerful and positive when you feel connected to it. Great comments in the chat. So Catherine, what's been interesting here in Northern Germany is that people don't typically talk to strangers. And it took me a while to feel comfortable, even as someone who prefers introversion, with a lack of casual incidental contact. Fascinating, right? Yeah. And by the way, I appreciate the distinction between Northern, Southern, right? That there are geographical differences. You can't make a unilateral reference to a country and say they all do this, they all do that. I appreciate that. Anyone want to share? Unmute and just throw something into the conversation. I mean, Sue, you've spent a lot of time in different places. So how do you experience those cultural influences?
Oh, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, certainly, you'd think on the surface of it that moving from Britain to New Zealand would have been quite easy, but actually it was quite difficult. They're English speaking, they're predominantly white, there's a lot of similarities, but it actually was, there was a lot of subtle differences. They certainly, I don't think, have a stabilizer temperament predominantly. I would say they were more improviser than stabilizer. So that sort of, have a go Kiwi, they'll do anything as long as they don't have to pay for it. So that was interesting that, what I thought would happen wasn't quite what happened. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, and then, you get into the SPs even more so perhaps in Australia, where, like the improviser concept is, part of the national ethos, right? So it's like almost to the exclusion of, well, why would we want to think about the future? We'll just figure it out, right? Yeah, I love it. Other observations, questions?
Hi, Rob. I'll jump in here. So not speaking about actual countries, I'm from Canada, but not speaking about the culture of the country, which of course has an impact. But I grew up in a farming community. And that was a very different perspective for me and for the community themselves, because very hands-on, very practical, probably more traditionalist. So when little Yvonne decided she wanted to go to university and nobody had even graduated high school, in our community, it was, what is wrong with you? What are you thinking? And so that was just a very interesting environment where my mom was pushing, yes, go, do all the things I couldn't do. But the community themselves were like, she must think she's so much better than the rest of us in this small little rural town in Alberta. So yeah, very definite impact. Although I pushed through because that's who I am.
Well, so first of all, you just encapsulated the entire concept I'm trying to articulate. So thank you. That notion of how do I withstand, or how do I create the wherewithal to go through the feedback I'm getting to not go through. And I'm glad to hear that your mom was out there, cheerleading for you, right? But it's not something that everyone has the capability to pull off. And it is interesting to reflect, and I don't have any data on this, that certain personality types have an easier time breaking the orbit that they were put into initially than other types. I think maybe some judge or perceiver elements in there. The perceiver is like, yeah, I'll get to that one day. And the one day is 10, 20, 30 years later if they're not careful. Really, really great share. Thank you, Yvonne.
Yeah.
Other observations? All right. Education. Reflect on this one, right? Curious what you think. Did you choose a
Sorry,
schooling
I
path?
thought I was unmuted, but I wasn't. It was but my family, primarily my family culture, but also the school I was in and everything, expected I'd go to university and do something sensible with my life, including my parents particularly thought I'd be an engineer because all the best people are engineers. This is the family culture. And I was going to be an art student and then go and do fashion design or something. They said, well, whatever you want, but that's a bit disappointing. So I was definitely going against the family culture, and it was made easier by moving to England, changing countries, because then they thought, well, this is a good thing, she's seeing the world. And they encouraged that aspect. But it definitely had to break away from family expectations.
The engineering, that's what the smart people do, right?
My mother was an engineer during the war,
That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
As a student, not once she got married.
But it's interesting to trace the family roots for where these definitions come from, right? So, if it's farming, it's a family tradition, right? So breaking away from that is multiple generations likely. The engineering piece can be lawyers, right? Well, grandpa was a lawyer, dad was a lawyer, mom's a lawyer. There's a family inertia, sort of like an expectation within that. All right, so as you consider the educational element next, this is another spot where I want you to consider the temperaments as well as the preferences. So your course of study may have been influenced by parents or other, your friends at school and so on. But I'd love to point out, for example, just as a way to prime the pump for you, Jane Keys and I talk about this all the time. So the SPs, the experiencers, that part of the population is probably about 30%, right? But what percentage of school dropouts do you think are experiencer SPs? And it's significantly more than that, right? And it could be upwards of 70, 80%. So what is it about the traditional educational environment in most cultures that's not lining up for that particular temperament category? What does that mean? And so as you reflect on that, think about your own experience of what has been encouraging or discouraging. Yeah, Renee, it's a really interesting point. So the rote learning, more of the French school of thought, right? About, you just need to memorize this and you regurgitate it back. And there's a hard line for, poor performance. My son struggles with anything even hinting at that because ENTP, he wants to be creative. He wants to decide how to do the assignment, not follow the steps on how to do the assignment. And if he's just told specifically how to do it, he's like, well, what's the point? There's no element of creativity at all. Yeah, Laura, great distinction between the early education and the later education. I think a lot of people find their stride at the university level. Yeah, say Lou, same thing. Yeah. In fact, yeah, disconcerting because like all of a sudden, like, this is great. It's not supposed to be great. Yeah. Interesting, Sue. Yeah.
I was gonna add, don't know if everyone can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, great. I work with teachers across the world, and not every country, but most say the education system favors I preference, and only teachers in Nigeria and Italy have said it's the other way around. So I think that's quite interesting. Also, N preferences tend to do better later on in their education than at the beginning.
Thank you for sharing, David.
Also, the kids that get into trouble at school, when I work with those, they are invariably ESTP or ENTP. It's just a scary pattern.
Yeah. Very consistent. Yeah, I'm thinking the same lines here for sure. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, David. And for my part, you know, one of the reasons why I just wanted to go straight out to work is because if somebody put me in a library for another double period, I was simply going to die. It was just too much for me. I needed to be busy. And also I discovered, you know, after I decided not to do the uni route and I learned about type, that actually ESTJs are one of the most common types to drop out of tertiary education because it's too theoretical. You know, there's, and also you're not earning, so you feel like you're getting poorer and poorer as you go through. So, you know, I just really wanted to go and work and earn and do my thing and become independent as quickly as possible.
I have a sister 1 year older who's an ISTJ, and she tutored me all the way through primary school. And because I couldn't understand anything in class. And so she taught me, especially when it came to mathematics and things like that, because that was really her super intelligence. And I think that if I hadn't had that support, I wouldn't have been successful in secondary, because I could then build on that foundation to go further. But that secondary was really when I met teachers and subjects that I finally got hold of and could love.
Mark, a great share. And that's consistent with what David's suggesting as well. So that intuitive preference had a little bit more autonomy, freedom, and creativity as you got further along. You know, it's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but I'll suggest it. I believe that a lot of people who feel disconnected from their educational experience also have self-worth questions. Right. So like if you're really not great at math and then, you know, you're put into the special class, at least how it typically works, that's going to have an impact on how you perceive yourself as, you know, capable and smart and worthy and all these other things. And so, to the extent that it's not just encouraging or discouraging our natural personalities to emerge, it may also actually have some foundational issues in terms of our self-worth and other things that, you know, again, the ISFJ teacher that I had may have created a perfect environment for an ISFJ, but as an ENTP, I was sitting there going like, wait a second, this is not hitting the mark for me.
I didn't ever think that I was intelligent, even all the way through university. I mean, I knew I could manage until my husband, who's an INTP and an engineer, said to me, and I don't mean this to me like sound bragging, but he said, you're like one of the smartest people I know. He said, you understand concepts about math and science so much more quickly than I would have expected from your background. And I suddenly saw myself in a completely different way. My sister also became an aeronautical engineer, the 1 year older. And so I always thought that was her area and not mine.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, right? So yeah, that's her thing, not my thing. You know, I can't hold a candle to it. So yeah, I have a friend who really, really, really likes music, and I like music, but I can't hold a candle to him when I'm having a conversation. So I just, steer clear of it. All right, onward. Experiences. So this includes things like your friends, right? Who have you bumped into along the way? Have you traveled to places? Now, I don't mean like, to, far-flung corners of the globe, but outside of your normal environment where you grew up. How did that impact you? How did that change you? Did you find a tribe? Which is going to be a theme we're going to talk about towards the end of today's session. People who get you, understand you, and encourage you to be who you are, or at least accept who you are. Yeah, go ahead,
Rob, may I just go back a little bit, because something that Marky said really sort of struck a chord with me. And that is that if you have a sibling who is a lot better than you at something, then that close connection to somebody who has some expertise that you doesn't really makes you feel less than. And so you do, okay, that's my sibling's thing, but it's not my thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, as well as parenting, it's also the influence of your siblings. You know, my twin sister is a brilliant artist. And for ages, I thought I didn't have an artistic bone in my body, but I actually do. It's just different to hers.
Yeah.
But
It's
I
really
just shied away from it. The comparison is too much.
I completely agree. And look, these are our earliest peers against, you know, who we're comparing, right? We're saying, you know, how do I stack up to? I actually think it's difficult for younger siblings in particular, because, you know, regardless of their natural proclivity for a certain area, they're just older and they're able to do things that, you know, you're not able to do yet.
Yeah, and that rivalry is a real human thing, isn't it, between siblings in mammals generally, but also in people.
Yeah, for sure. Great share, Marky, on the geographic switch from California to New England. Big difference, right? And I've had plenty of people say the reverse, which is they found their home out of New England in, you know, a southern state, or, you know, out west, where it's a little bit more casual or whatever. Yeah. Chris has a follow-up question for you there, Marky.
Partly they're people who don't know my family, don't call me by my birth name, and see me for who I am today rather than who they think I am as their little sister. I'm the youngest of 5. And we were all very close in age, so I was always the baby of the family. And most of my family still doesn't treat me like an adult. And I'm in my late 50s.
So maybe anywhere that wasn't there would do. I'm the middle of 5, so similar issues.
All right, everyone scored. You got this tracking. All right, let's try gender. All right, so the question to consider is, what are your culture's expectation of you from a gender perspective? And so, you know, where this typically comes up in a type conversation will be at the thinking and the feeling dimension, right? So if you have a woman who's a strong thinking type, right, what has that meant for her from a cultural perspective in terms of meeting the expectation? Or a man on the feeling side. And again, it depends on your culture, right? So certain cultures encourage the opposite of what I just articulated. Just wondering, you thinking about that lens and saying to yourself, geez, how much have I had to accommodate in this, or how much was just handed to me given who I was already wired to be?
Yeah, a theory about that. You know, of course, first as INFP preference, you know, in an ESTJ kind of business world, I always felt I'm less good than he is, and I'm less good than she is, but so far so good, you know. And when they say, oh, you should do this thing, it's called Myers-Briggs, I said, no. If they know what's going on in there, they know I don't have the right profile to be a leader, and that's the end of my career. And then I did it, and I was validated because people knew what they were talking about. But you know, in terms of the gender thing, there's always this thing, or you know, the pay gap is due because women don't know how to negotiate or fight for their rights or whatever. And I think it's less about gender and it's more about TF preference, you know. And I think that it's TF preference that struggles to do that. And of course, there's been a majority of women with an F preference, and so there's a correlation there. But I'm wondering, and that's my theory, I don't know what the others think about that.
I'll back that up. So when we talk about assertiveness and we talk about visibility, and we talk about extroversion, introversion, we talk about thinking and feeling. And so at a women's leadership conference, I did at ESA, right? So the people on the panel were all extrovert thinking women, and they didn't have those difficulties, right? And so they're telling the whole audience, well, you just have to do this. And the audience, the introverts in the audience are going like, I would rather cut off my hand than do what you just described. And the feelers like, I don't even know where to start with that. So I resonate with a lot of what you're saying there.
I wrote an article on that topic when I was at BT, because I was into type and talking about the glass ceiling and all that. And I thought the reason we don't have more women in senior management is because in technology is because most women are not interested in either technology or senior management. So that's the maths. They tried to encourage them, but.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And so Marky's also touching on some nuances in this one as well, right? So you may get a mix of, and so an overall score towards the middle. What's really interesting, so one of my sort of most memorable experiences was working with a lawyer who was an ENFP. And as we're going through the aspects of personality to clarify his type, we got to thinker feeler. And so his educational and family success was lawyer. You got to be a lawyer. And he could not say the word feeler. So when we got to which one do you think you are, he took a napkin out and wrote down feeler on it and passed it to me across the table. Because for him it was, and he sort of looked around like it was like a secret that he had been carrying. He knew, right? Intuitively, he understood that this was, the signal he'd been picking up looking around the room. But I find it fascinating. So like, he's got to be a pretty low score on the encourage here, right? He was not encouraged to look at the world from the feeler perspective and consider that and make choices in alignment with that. He was very clearly told, don't even say it, keep it to yourself, right? And this has been a theme for me a number of times in workshops. Men who are feelers will come up to me and give me a big hug and say, thank you for sort of taking that weight off my shoulder. I didn't know what it was about. And women who are thinkers, I'm just picking on that aspect because it's so such a strong evocation and validation for them when they have it explained. There's a little nuance too. So if you've been discouraged, right? So if there's a different expectation, often the benefit is pretty substantial, which is you get balanced early, right? So a woman with a strong thinking preference who's grown up in an environment where they want her to be more people-centered and sort of compassionate and all those other words, ends up picking up those skills, right? So the concept of the permission piece here is not to say that that's not valuable as a skill set, but you want to be making choices that still allow you to leverage and lean on your natural as opposed to living out of that preference for too long. All right, so thank you. I'm going to introduce, so these are my rough percentages. Again, not scientific. This is just my sense of the population at large. This is just the worlds that I've happened to move around. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of these four groups. So I'm going to say permission in denial is the person who's working with their head down towards the wrong goal and they don't know it yet. I had a client come to me once and he's like, Rob, I've just been promoted into a new role and I'm just not sure how I feel about it. I said, well, describe the role. He's like, well, my job is to find out that someone's done something wrong at the bank and then go threaten to fire them. And if they make the mistake again, I have to terminate them. And it turned out that he's an INFP. And I said, all right, so call him John. I'm like, John, I've got some great news for you. Any job will be better than your current job. Like, from a values perspective, from a day-to-day, I'm generalizing here. I'm not saying there's not an INFP out there who would enjoy this, but the sense of the feeling that he had about how this was not a good fit was such a strong feeling that he went from permission and denial to now he's working on it. By contrast, permission by default are people who have a very high score on most of the categories we went through. And without really any effort have been accepted for who they are by their society, their family, and so on, all the factors we've gone through. So a friend of mine here in town, his family is a very strong military family and then financial services. So he went into the military, went into financial services, works for his dad's firm with his two brothers, happy as a clam. I don't think he's ever picked up a hint of turbulence in his life that someone wants him to be something other than he is. And so he's had an easy path to permission. He didn't have to work at it. And then there's the next group, which is permission in progress, which is the people who are aware of what they're working on is not being a good fit and are sort of starting to make some strides in this direction. And then permission by design are the people who are kind of there at the self-acceptance level. And coincidentally, and this is kind of a little counterintuitive, but they're often people who scored really low on all aspects of natural encouragement from their environment. So low, in fact, that they had to sort of jettison all the external programs and come up with their own system. So I think Oprah, Tony Robbins, a few other people fall into this category. You hear their life stories and you're like, wow, how did you end up here? And the answer is they deleted everything and started over. They created their own framework and their own worldview, and they gave themselves permission to chart their own path. And that's not something you're going to see everyone has the wherewithal to pull off, but that's sort of just a food for thought item. So we've had discussion as we go along. So I'm going to just touch on a couple of things. So the one that comes to a lot of people's mind, especially some skeptics, is, all right, well, Rob, this concept of permission sounds great, but what happens when you have too much of it? And I'm not going to sort of go too far into this, but you can have some people who, don't think twice about how great they are, and aren't just self-accepting, but they are all the other things that go along with that. So I just want to mention that element as a watch out. So don't go too far in giving yourself permission, or you'll end up in a place you're not eager to end up. These are a couple thoughts I'd like to leave you with. So first thought is, where is your inertia currently heading you? Are you happy with the direction that you're in? Professionally, personally, relationship, etc. Because you're in an orbit of some kind. We all are. And I just want you to reflect on, is this orbit that you're in consistent with who you are from a psychological type perspective? Are there some tweaks or enhancements that you can make to get even more into a line, use your natural preferences more frequently on a day-to-day basis? And don't forget the temperament element. Are you living in alignment with those core values? And does it feel like a source of energy as opposed to a wishful? And then, the hard part is, making the change without waiting for an external event to come and hit you around the head. Consider the source is the next technique, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. And then finding your tribe. So consider the source. I can't take credit for this, but it is something I use all the time. So an author by the name of Barbara Winter wrote a book called Making a Living Without a Job. And so she talks about these multiple profit centers instead of having like a full-time job. And she said, but the problem is no one's going to understand what you're doing, and everyone's going to tell you why they think that's dumb. And so she said, I've got a simple solution for you, which is consider the source. If the person telling you that your career choice or your personal choices are dumb is the person that you aspire to be, someone you admire and respect, you should be taking notes on everything that they have to say. But if it's your crazy uncle at the holiday table telling you that you're dumb and blah, 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 and you have no desire to be like that person in the course of your life, please do not listen to that person or let them inform you with their sensible choices, right? They're just going to be barfing up whatever they think makes sense for themselves, or what the sensible thing to do is given the circumstance. I don't want you to do that. So consider the source allows you to deflect a lot of what society and our environmental influences throw at us. If you're able to discern that this is not a credible source for you to consider, but instead that. Now, the other final piece is to find your tribe, right? And I think this is one of the really cool things about the type community is that, I don't have to connect with Renee because we have 2 out of our 4 letters in common. We connect because I want to value him searching out for his INFP path, right? And that's what we're doing in the type community, is creating that environment for that validation and support. If you have friends who don't do that, I ask you, consider the source. You have to create some separation between what they're saying to you and internalizing that. But there's nothing like finding another ENTP to sort of shoot the breeze with and have them be like, I tell that to everyone and they think I'm crazy. I'm like, I don't think it's crazy. I think it's a great idea, right? Finding your tribe is a really powerful part of the process, and something that I hope can help people who are searching for more permission in their lives to get to. So it's 12:57 Eastern Standard Time. So coming up 2 minutes before, I'll close with just a moment of reflection. So what's 1 or 2 things you might take away? from the conversation today. I'm happy to stick around afterwards. I know we have a 30-minute break, so I can take some questions or observations, but we can formally wrap up. Sure thing, Carol. I'll make a poster of the slide. It's fine.
I mean, what you said makes a lot of sense. I mean, stuff I've experienced, and the concept of permission. I always thought, for instance, living abroad gives you permission to be someone different, because otherwise your family, your friends tell you, how dare you change? Why? You should be the way you are because you meet my needs exactly the way you are. And as an F, you like to please or whatever. So being abroad where people are ready to take you as you are. And I found that, yeah, I always thought it gives you permission to really explore and be different without feeling guilty about it, because we know also the NF tends to like to feel guilty about it. So that was my experience.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that. Thank you for sharing, Renee. Claire, the shirt thing is the conventional wisdom is to wear something more proper and professional. And I say, screw that. So I wore a shirt that I thought would say, I'm giving myself permission to wear something a little bit more flamboyant or whatever. So, next time you're putting on a boring old shirt, ask yourself if that's what you want to do.
Love that. That's great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the
Good.
conference. Thanks again for choosing our program here together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you.